For a reaction to the Vatican's landmark announcement, we're joined by Access Chapter 2 Executive Director Steve Letsike. Steve, good to catch up with you. Now, how important is it for an organization such as the Catholic Church, which has millions of members across the continent and across the globe, in fact, to make this decision?
No, thank you. Good evening to you and the viewers of Newzroom. Look, Catholic Church has a long history in terms of debates around LGBTI persons, and also how the church itself has taught, really tolerance, acceptance, respect, compassion, and sensitivity. And I think we must actually recognize this long history. But I think the position that the Catholic Church had maintained over time around, marriage, as a space or a kind of a lifelong commitment with opposite sex, heterosexual in this case. Now, I think over time, because of these debates and what Pope Francis has announced is actually welcomed as a very critical shift, which is radical for a Catholic that has been actually against it for such a long time. Now, the idea here of blessing is welcoming and actually respecting and embracing same-sex persons or LGBTI persons, who wants to be brought closer to God and who also are members of the faith or belief community. And I think it's quite critical, and it's a warm welcome conversation, but also blessings for that matter. I think where we have been quite critical of this position is that, given the fact that, while there cannot be a rejection of blessing the union of same-sex couples within Catholic space, but it will not necessarily be regarded as marriage. It's something that, of course, it will take some time, but I think we are in the right step of a time where we actually need to affirm people should not be really requested to justify the love for each other.
Now, we don't assume for a moment that the announcement by the Pontiff that there's going to be global acceptance of this decision. I presume that members of the LGBTQI plus community will still continue to face a certain amount of resistance in certain quarters, particularly on the African continent.
No doubt. I think you are spot on. As much as this is a critical, radical shift and announcement, which is welcomed by many, but it equally will be rejected by many. And I think we must be understanding that the long history of how fundamentalism, which has already captured the religious context, and there was a particular narrative that rejected same-sex persons, that rejected LGBTI people, that actually continued to move a wrong narrative, will actually organize itself to develop the anti-rights, anti-gender movement. But I think we have to know in society it's expected to be like that. But where society actually abuses their role and the power and actually does not actually tolerate, accept, and embrace others, it's actually, that on its own contradicting the space of faith and the space of a God-like principle or Christ-like principle, often that is led here, that you are not the judge. And that is the case. Catholic and Pope Francis is actually communicating that you will not be judged in the Catholic space, and that's the message people need to be moving on.
Now, the Pontiff is also recognized as the Holy Father in the Catholic Church. And I want to take this conversation to Uganda, who've recently passed laws, draconian laws as they've been referred to, against the LGBTI Q plus community. Now, the Catholic Church represents 40% of or religious followers in a place like Uganda. What are the implications of this specifically, do you think, on the LGBTIQ plus community in Uganda?
You know, we are having this conversation today. In Uganda, as we are having this conversation, there was a hearing at the Constitutional Court, and it's quite important to really mark what the Catholic Pope Francis has announced versus also the outstanding judgment by the Ugandan Constitutional Court. In addition to this, by the way, it's also to look at what is happening in Ghana, where over 40 bishops, of Catholic and other denomination had come out in support of same-sex practicing individuals. People came out in support of LGBTI persons. But what we know, the implications of such is that, the narrative that has been taught was a narrative of intolerance, a narrative of hate. And unfortunately, we all as human beings have to face and confront the stigma and discrimination we posed towards LGBTI persons, and to a point where LGBTI persons were subjected to torture, to hate, to murder, to rape, and many all these social ills. We have to overcome as Africans, because Africans have been a community and people.
Steve, I'm going to ask you to hold that thought. We're going to come back to it. We're speaking to Access Chapter 2's Executive Director, Steve Letsike, around the Vatican's decision to bless same-sex marriages. That conversation will continue in a moment. Don't go away. Now, the Vatican has specified certain conditions, such as not... we've actually lost Steve. We're going to try and reconnect in a moment. You are watching News Feed at the PM edition. Let's carry on with other stories. Opposition parties and independent observers are concerned ahead of tomorrow's elections in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Faulty voting cards and electoral list delays are some of the problems threatening the legitimacy of the vote. President Felix Tshisekedi is seeking re-election but faces stiff opposition and criticism for failing to address rising attacks by the M23 rebels in the country's mineral-rich east. Nearly 7 million people have been displaced, forcing many into crowded camps without water, power or reliable access to food and jobs. We continue to get reaction to the Vatican's landmark announcement, and Steve Letsike, Executive Director of Access Chapter 2, joins us now. Steve, we were having that conversation before the break, and you were just expressing your sentiments around the support that Catholic bishops, I think in Ghana you mentioned, that have come out in support of these announcements.
No, indeed. In fact, the support that we've seen of the Catholic bishops in Ghana actually is standing against the proposed anti-homosexuality law, that members of parliament in Ghana had proposed as a law to consider, which already exists, by the way, because you will acknowledge that about 28 countries in Africa still criminalizes homosexual act. And I think we've seen countries that decriminalized recently. Mozambique have decriminalized, as well as many others. But I think what is key in terms of the announcement by the Vatican, it's really around how we have to deal with the injustices of the past, even within the faith space, where we all are made in the image of God. And if that is understood, where we can accept, respect, and really honor one another as human beings, we can do better. And I think the faith community has that responsibility. And what the Catholic Church now has the duty in blessing and not also rejecting people will actually allow people to understand what it means to bring people closer to God.
Steve, you talk about countries like Mozambique, which are on the African continent and have decriminalized same-sex marriages, or certainly certain rights for the queer community. What has been that process, though, of them come into a position of decriminalizing some of those acts? There must be a certain amount of advocacy that's taken place.
Yeah. Look, I think, we have seen the growth of LGBTI community. I mean, many organizations such as Access Chapter 2, but many others in the region have been resisting to this torture and, a denial of rights, just of those human rights by being human. But we've seen different countries have actually displayed ways of which they deal with it. Others opt for a judicial approach where there's a litigation approach itself. The organization or individuals will take these matters through court. But countries like Mozambique, Seychelles, countries like Angola did not depend on a court outcome where you would actually look at it as a malicious compliance for that matter. But countries of Angola, Mozambique, Seychelles that actually have reviewed their own constitution, and followed the example of South Africa when we reviewed and developed the constitution that protects every human being on the basis also of their sexual orientation and gender identity. But others like Botswana, Mauritius, and so forth have actually gone into court, and the outcome have actually declared these laws as unconstitutional, and that countries must actually ensure that LGBTI people are protected. And those will constitute what I have said as malicious compliance to the rights. And this is global universal human rights as well.
Steve, let's go back to the Pope's announcement. And the Vatican emphasizes that blessings should not be confused with the sacrament of marriage. How do you interpret this distinction? And does it align with recognition of same-sex relationships?
I mean, look, no doubt, there has always been debates, within the Catholic space, within also other denominations as well, of what constitute, or how we define marriage. You would also understand, even us as a country, we've come a long way. We have 3 types of marriage even here in South Africa, and which actually Minister Motsoaledi had proposed one marriage bill that, respects everybody despite their faith or despite their identity. And I think one thing you must acknowledge why these debates will continue until we define and redefine it in a just and an affirmative manner, of a marriage is a union of people who love each other, and there's a consent element of it, and it's not necessarily locked only in the context of men or women, and we embrace others. We have to really realize that we exist for that matter. So the faith space are still debating that, and unfortunately the discussions are not moving as fast that we would all appreciate, but we all have to be part of the solution that helps to sensitize, that helps to educate, that helps to unlearn certain things. And it's okay as well to understand that not everyone would understand even the institution of marriage, but the idea of civil union, the idea of coming together because of love will be what is embraced. And exactly this is where we are with the Catholic community, that they are in that step, and we have to really embrace that. But we're hoping that this will also guide other denominations to understand that element of blessing unions because of love is necessary. But also it must trickle down to the community level. It must not just be a policy issue or a letter written by Pope Francis. It must trickle down to ordinary congregations about what constitutes blessing a couple or a union for that matter.
Steve Letsike, Access Chapter 2 Executive Director, appreciate your time this evening. A lot to look forward to when the show returns. Don't go away.